action in the past. Now it can be iterative. There's all sorts of syntactical categories you can break that down into. But when talking about the Logos, it's ein. Until you reach verse 14. And then when you reach verse 14, Kai ha Logos sarx egeneta. And the Word became flesh. Now, I suppose there would be many people who would argue, big deal. We can't give John too much credit for really thinking through his use of verbs and things like that. I give John a whole lot more credit than that. And it's very obvious that he is seeking to communicate something to us by this use of ein versus egeneta. There was a point in time where the Logos became flesh. That's the incarnation. So if there was a point in time at which the Word became flesh, then by using a different verbal form for John 1:1, was there a point in time where the Logos became? Well, according to Mr. Navas, there was, but not according to John. According to John, the Logos is eternal. As far back as you want to push this beginning, NRK. Some people say, well, this is the beginning, this is actually creation. Well, the Logos preexists that. Any beginning you want to put, the Logos is eternal. Now, I made this argument in my book. Mr. Navas quotes my statement of it, but doesn't refute my assertion of it. So, John 1:1a, the Word has eternally existed. John 1:1b, Kai ha Logos ein pros ton theon, and the Word was pros, God, was with God. And again, ein, you're talking about some kind of relationship here, because it's not a spatial relationship. I mean, pros can be used spatially, but it is a personal relationship. Whatever this Logos is, just as long as Logos has been, the Logos has been in relationship with ton theon, with God. And then you have, of course, the big argument. Kai theos ein ha Logos, and the Word was God. It cannot be, and God was the Word. And this is what's amazing to me. This is a basic fundamental point. I mentioned this in The Forgotten Trinity. And on page 53, here you go. It starts on page 53. I'm explaining the significance of the article. And I said, stay with me now, for there is another important point to be seen in the text. If both of the nouns in a predicate nominative construction, like this one, have the article, or if both lack the article, this is significant as well. In that case, the two nouns become interchangeable. That is, if Word had the article and God did too, this would mean that John is saying that God was the Word and the Word was God. Both would be the same thing. Or if neither of them had the article, we would have the same idea, an equating of all of God with all the Word. God and Word would be interchangeable in equal terms. So, if the third clause of John 1:1 was Kai ha theos ein ha Logos, then we could translate that as was God was the Word, or the Word was God. And the point would be that the two terms are interchangeable and exhaustive of one another. That would be exactly what Roger Perkins would wish it says. That's exactly what the oneness folks would want that to say. But it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. Now, this one, then in verse 2, this one was in the beginning with God. So you have again ein, you have the NRK, you have a summary of the preceding verse, emphasizing that this one, the Logos, this was the one who in the beginning was with God. All the arguments you want to make about wisdom or creation at some point in time, you're stuck with the fact that the Logos is eternal. All things are made by or through him. Dia with the genitive, look up means, syntax, it's all right there. And apart from him, nothing was made. That which was made in him was life, is one way of punctuating it. The other way of putting it is, apart from him was nothing made which was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light was shining in the darkness, and darkness did not comprehend or receive it or overcome it. There's all sorts of different ways we can look at it. Kateleben. Now, then you have a discussion of John, and you have the discussion of the gospel and truth, and then you have the incarnation in verse 14. Kai ha logos sarx agenita, and the word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us, skenao, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the monogenes, and the meaning of that is not overly disputable, even in its form. There's only one new in there. It comes from genos, not genao, as of a unique one, para patros, from the Father, full of grace and truth. And John testifies concerning this one. He talks about the law of Moses, grace and truth comes to Jesus Christ, and then you have the end of the prologue. And what you have in the prologue is something called bookending. You have the first verse and then the last verse are bookends. They are explaining and defining for us what the author wants you to hear from the prologue to this book. And since this is the prologue, this is the lens through which John wants you to read everything else. You miss it here, you're going to miss it everywhere else. And what does it say? Theon, notice there's no article there. Theon udais heoraken popete. No one has seen God at any time. Monogenes theos, the unique God, haon aistan kalpan tu patras ekainos exegesata. So, no one has seen God at any time. The unique God, the one who is haon, present participle, existing, it's literally in the bosom of the Father. I like the close to the Father's heart, at the Father's side. It is a restatement of what we had before with proston theon. That one has exegeted him, has explained him, has made him known. Now, when you listen to the entirety of the prologue, when you listen to what the author is saying in the context in which he's saying it, recognizing he's a monotheistic Jew, you're not going to go running off. Remember when we were prepping for Australia, we responded to some of the things that Abdullah Kunda said about the Logos and Philo and stuff like that. And we said there is a significantly more direct connection for the background of Logos. It's not Greek philosophy, though I'm sure John had some concept of that. It is the Word in the Old Testament. God's speech, God's speaking. And so when you allow John's context to stand, what has he told us? Well, is it true that no one has seen God at any time? In the Old Testament, there's a number of places where men saw God. And so if it stopped right there, you'd go, well, John, what do you mean? But then he uses this amazing phrase, monogenes theos. Now, there is a textual variant there. But, interestingly enough, even Mr. Navas does not try to argue that point. He recognizes that the papyri evidence for monogenes is very strong. Monogenes theos. Now, there have been some folks, Jay Green, for example, that's Gnosticism. No, it's not. In any way, shape, or form. Monogenes theos, when we recognize the true meaning of monogenes, and I was listening to a Dia Muhammad fellow down in Australia, I guess. He's a Muslim. Wow, listening to him talking about monogenes and begotten was painful. It was just painful to listen to it. Not even close to anything even slightly scholarly on that. It was. I'd love to get hold of him and say, could we dialogue about this? This is bad. But monogenes theos, you put the two terms together. And hey, I didn't put them there. John did. You got to deal with that. And there's something about this relationship between the Logos and the Father. Because we know the Theon here is the Father. That's what it says. He is at the Father's side. So Patros, right there in the text. You can't get around that identification. That's the same identification in John 1:1. There is an intimate relationship that exists between the Logos and the Father. And it's such an intimate relationship that not only is the Logos described as theos, but he is uniquely theos, and he has the capacity of exegeting and explaining the Father. I say to you, no mere creature. And if you're on that side of the creator-creation divide, you're a creature. No mere creature can exegete the Father. No mere creature has ever been close to the Father's heart and then became flesh and exegeted him. Don't talk to me about Michael the Archangel or anything else. These are not words fitting for a creature. You can make all the excuses you want. They're not fitting for a creature. And I would not want to have to stand before him and say, I just thought you were a creature. I just don't want to go there. Now, with that said, let me address two things real quick because I still got to get to John 5, and I knew I'd start preaching, and I apologize. Well, I don't apologize. That's why I rushed down here to do this. I'm not apologizing one little bit. One of the works that has been produced and is constantly quoted by a fellow by the name of Jason Dune, B first, D second, Badun, from up at NAU, which is ironic since I was just in Flagstaff, which is where NAU is. He is quoted on page 273. In his book on Bible translation, Badun also remarked